Bermuda is pretty much an underwater museum. We've got the coral platform, and these red dots just denote shipwrecks around Bermuda. Bermuda's got about 390 known shipwrecks. All these shipwrecks are here because we've got this treacherous reef that extends 8 miles off North Shore and 1 mile off South Shore. They're shipwrecks from European exploration, colonial expansion, maritime commerce, and warfare. We've got Portuguese, Spanish, French, Irish, Dutch, American. And those shipwrecks represent 500 years of Bermuda's interaction with the Atlantic world.
All the way to Baylor's Bay, fish and taters every single day. They used to sing and dance as they went along, singing a happy but a teasing kind of song. Yeah, man.
When Bermuda was first discovered in 1505, it quickly became the beacon to ships coming from the New World back to Portugal or Spain or to Europe. Bermuda was a tiny little dot in the Atlantic, but played a very strategic role because of our location. I'm Elena Strong. I'm the curator of the National Museum of Bermuda. As the curator, I'm in charge of the collection, research, and education programming at the museum. What's amazing about shipwrecks are that they are time capsules. And when they go down, they lock in everything that was going on at that time. And so you can see what the cargo is, what trade relations are. And so all of that reef is trapped. Amazing world heritage on our doorstep.
Bermuda was ideally situated for ships going back to Europe, particularly Spain, because it was right in that path. It was a replenishment for the next stage of the run, which probably 1,500 miles or more. My name is William McCallan, or Billy McCallan. I'm a commercial fisherman, and I have a hobby which is looking for shipwrecks. Many people play golf. My choice was commercial fishing and looking for shipwrecks. And I've been extremely lucky to have both. Over the years, I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. I have been very successful in finding shipwrecks and had the pleasure of working with some pretty unique people. One being Teddy Tucker, which I learned a tremendous amount from. The finding it is not too bad. That just involves a lot of effort, time, water time, say. I spent many occasions 8 hours underwater a day. In some cases longer. You stayed there and you just got so involved. The deeper you get involved, the more interesting it becomes.
My name is William Gillies. I started in 1965, diving with Harry Cox. I was interested in studying corals, and when I got my scuba gear, I approached him and asked him if he'd take me out, and he said, well, I go to shipwrecks, but there are corals around shipwrecks. So I went out and looked around out there and got curious about the wreck that he went to. And I went and fanned in the sand there, and I was incredibly fortunate. And I found a small bell, about maybe 5 or 6 inches tall. And the wreck was around 1550, so it was a good find. We called it the bell wreck because of the bell. So then I got bitten by the bug and forgot about corals, and I concentrated on shipwrecks.
Most shipwrecks that you look at have been picked over either by early Bermudians or by the early pioneers of the divers. They quickly discovered the large number of wrecks that were on the reef. I'm Nick Hutchings, and I've seen a lot of wrecks, maybe 50, 60, 70. Every time we go out after a storm or a hurricane, we discover more. Those discoveries are less frequent than they were, but they're still happening. I think they'll still continue to happen for a couple of centuries as we start looking deeper.
My father was an amateur diver who was interested in shipwrecks. So I grew up in a household full of artifacts, and there were conservation efforts going on in the yard and people visiting and identifying things. I'm Jane Downing. I'm the registrar at the National Museum of Bermuda. And shipwreck material in particular has been very interesting to pull all the various collections together and begin to tie them all together intellectually from one shipwreck to another. We have a lot of information about certain sites that have been excavated on a number of occasions. And these can be revisited with modern archaeology, and a lot more information can be recovered and analyzed. So it's very rewarding.
There's no question that a wide range, a broad spectrum of Bermudians of all economic backgrounds and races were involved until quite recently in caring about shipwrecks. I'm Dr. Philippe Rouja, the principal scientist for the Department of Conservation Services and also the custodian of historic wrecks for the islands of Bermuda, which means I manage the incredible array of shipwrecks we have around the island in our beautiful azure waters. And it's a great privilege to have a chance to sort of meet all the various people and intrigues and everything that surround our incredible island history of shipwrecks. There's a huge amount of knowledge that people have sort of carried forward. And I would suggest that there's a bigger underground history of people dealing and looking at shipwrecks in Bermuda than we can even imagine.
When you're on this isolated island, no manufacturing goods, you couldn't manufacture all of these great stuff like the rigging components of a ship. So an early activity in Bermuda from colonization 1612 into the 1800s, locals would salvage shipwrecks. After the Second World War, Bermuda was broke. We needed foreign currency. And one of the ways for locals to do that was to salvage metal from shipwrecks. And during that period, that's when Teddy Tucker found the San Pedro. And that is when Bermuda got on the map for having historic shipwrecks. And that's what encouraged people like MENDEL PETERSON, one of the pioneers of underwater archaeology, to come down to Bermuda. And so we've got this transition of just salvaging shipwrecks for monetary use to actually seeing shipwrecks as this historic archive where you can uncover aspects of our past and trading relationships and ship technology and seafaring techniques of the past.
Having access to the resources that shipwrecks provided throughout history has been important. And so the early Bermudians, of course, were very good salvers. Working on shipwrecks was a very important part of the island's balance of trade. In fact, one year it represented the highest percentage of foreign earned income in the island. Between June and December of 1687, Bermudian captains landed over 16,000 pounds of silver and over a ton of gold in the colony. This was worth in total over 48,000 in sterling, a value equal to the colony's entire tobacco crop for a decade. And that really pushed Bermuda into that really very, very successful 100 years of maritime economy. So it has been and remained until very recently a very important economic activity.
The incredible thing about looking for shipwrecks and finding shipwrecks is that it is, at its base, a local enterprise. There's enough of them around that you're going to bump into some or you'll find some here and there, but the guys who truly have developed those skills and know where these things are and can repeatedly take you back to these places, these are people with long histories of being on the ocean in Bermuda, you know, from childhood right the way through, of someone who fishes every day. So it really is still a very local, eyes and hands, you know, kind of activity.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, bully. Yeah. Okay, good.
When we used to look for wrecks, we'd hang on a rope back of the boat and watch the bottom, looking for signs of shipwrecks. I used to see nothing at first. The other guys who had more experience than me would be letting go the rope and hollering out, "Oh, shipwreck, shipwreck," and I'd see nothing. And I used to go back and say, "Hey, show me what you saw." And next time I see that, I'll know what it is. And like anything else, if you do it often enough, you get good at it. And gradually, I got good at it. And we found quite a few wrecks, good wrecks too.
Most of my finding has been with Teddy, because I spent so much time with him, and Teddy would operate the boat and I would be behind the boat dragging, and he'd do a grid or whatever up and down, and if we saw anything that looked different, then we would investigate it. There's a few things I would look for. Number one, if I saw something, it's more than likely going to be ballast. Ballast is river rock or mountain rock, which has been dumped in certain sections of the ship to counterbalance. Most of the shipwrecks, unless they have a heavy cargo, are likely to be under ballast. Relatively close to this ballast, there may be some cannon, and within that same area, one end or the other, there could be an anchor or two anchors. This indicates right off the bat that the ship more than likely never got salvaged.
The thing is, with shipwrecks, they're very dynamic, and they're in very dynamic environments. The big shipwrecks are pretty obvious, and it's when you move on to the older shipwrecks that are grown into the reef and buried in the sand, it's where they become really interesting and far more subtle. Spent a lot of time just being towed around behind the boat. It's a really cool experience. You get to see a lot of the landscape of that reef, and you start to learn the whole set of skills that help you recognize what the shipwrecks are. It's not like the Baltic or the Great Lakes where you have old wooden ships sitting there with the masts up and the cannons run out of the gun ports. This is a shallow coral reef, and shipwrecks get smashed down pretty fast. And what's left above the sand is usually eaten away, floats away, breaks up, and is gone. So the older the shipwreck, the more difficult they are to find. You very seldom will you see the actual shipwrecks itself, and what's preserved is below the sand. Sometimes it covers and uncovers, and you can see some structure, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. One of the things you're looking for is a sand hole full of these rocks, ballast piles we call them, and every time you see them, you have to let go and swim down and have a look, because the brain corals in a storm will break off, and they roll around the bottom. They get sandpapered into perfect little round rocks that look just like ballast stones or granite river rocks when the coral grows over them. You just grab one and turn it over. It will tell you whether it's an old brain coral or whether it's a ballast stone. So that's certainly one of the clues. Obviously, if you see a cannon or an anchor, that's great. But more often than not, you're looking for very subtle clues. These old wooden shipwrecks were really well built, and they were tough. When they would get in and encounter the reefs, they would break the reef up. If you look carefully, you can see where an old ship has come through the reef. It's what we call a scrub mark. In a lot of cases, the wrecks bounce and they deposit stuff as they go. And the only way that you can develop this skill set of finding old shipwrecks is by coming out here in the boat, getting in the water, and towing.
I was able to put a lot of time because it was in conjunction with my livelihood. And it took me a long time to learn it. But I suppose you could say I got a little water smart. Rather than street smart, I got water smart. And we just kept finding shipwrecks. There is an instrument which is called a proton magnetometer, which is what you use for dragging to detect metals and stuff like that. But it don't work in Bermuda because Bermuda's volcanic. It will pick up the iron ore, but it could be a mile down. Another unit is what they call a side scanner, and that doesn't work here because of the contour of the bottom and the corals and the rest of it.
One of the interesting things about Bermuda is that a lot of the technology that will work in other places doesn't work here. If you take a magnetometer down to the Turks and Caicos, those magnetic fields are nice and uniform. So if you're towing a magnetometer and you get a hit, send your diver overboard because you know there's a shipwreck there. The problem with Bermuda is we're sitting on top of this really interesting volcano, which is made up of all kinds of different types of lavas. So we have basically a magnetic patchwork quilt, and they don't work very well here. They find some shipwrecks, and then in other areas they won't find anything. So it's very frustrating. So we continually go back to the old and tried way of looking for shipwrecks, which is towing somebody behind the boat with a mask and a snorkel and just eyeballing it, which is one of the reasons why Bermuda will continue to produce important shipwrecks for the next couple of centuries, because we don't have the opportunity to deploy technology in such a way that we can systematically search with confidence that all the shipwrecks that are there will be found.
The fundamental sort of principle of dealing with shipwrecks is getting underwater. Well, the fundamental principle is finding them. And then the second one is finding them again. Because finding them once isn't good enough. You have to be able to find them consistently. Bermuda, with its maze of reef and et cetera that have lost so many shipwrecks, have also lost a lot of shipwrecks that have been found. The amount of stories of locals who say, I found this incredible shipwreck, and then I never saw it again. There's hundreds of those. So there's a lot of Bermudians who've been deeply involved and caring about shipwrecks. Every fishing site was a shipwreck site, you know. And so while they may not be overtly out there looking for shipwrecks, they really have managed to capture information about Bermuda and about its environment that is going to be, frankly, pretty impossible for anyone to replicate in this day and age. We think we're doing better with satellite mapping, and we have all these great techniques for doing things and so on and so forth, but the Bermuda shipwreck thing in particular highlights just how limited those technological attributes are in terms of our understanding and management of what's out there.
I was towing behind the boat and I spotted some ballast on a reef top. There was only about 15 feet of water. So I dived down and put my hand out to steady myself, and the thing that I touched moved, so I picked it up, and it was an elephant's tusk. So I brought it up and I said to Harry, look at this, what's this doing out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, you know? So he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, put a buoy here, so we got a mark, and then go around in ever-widening circles, and we might pick up something else. And we did. We picked up some broken olive jars and some lignum vitae logs, which is a very hard wood that survives well. And Harry said, I'm going down and have a look at this place. And I went alongside of him, and he went like this, nothing here, you know. And just as he said that, down tumbles this black thing out of the sand, and it was a piece of 8, a silver coin. He found some more, and then a couple of circlets came out, but they were yellow. They were gold. And he got all excited, and I could hear him shouting in his mouthpiece, gold, 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 you know. So I fanned, and I found a circlet and I think a coin, if I remember correctly, a Portuguese coin. So then he ran out of air because he'd been huffing and puffing because he's excited. And he signed to me, I'm going up. And so I signed back to him, send me down the airlift, which is sort of an underwater vacuum cleaner. The airlift came down and I put it where I was standing, and it whipped off the sand, and there was a 15.5-foot gold chain right there all through the reef. That made my day, sort of, you know. So for about 2 years, we came back on top of the reef and found nothing, virtually nothing, a few little tiny gold beads. And then one day I was digging with the airlift, and up bubbled this green thing. It was an emerald from Colombia, and it weighed just a touch under 5 carats. That's about it on the treasure site. It all fits in a cigar box very nicely. So, well, I don't think it was a treasure ship. It's only one man's little thing from the New World. We never found any pieces of the wreck or anything. That's all there was there. No guns, no anchors, just a couple of pieces of ballast, the elephant's tusk, and the so-called treasure. So it's a mystery where it is, but we worked the area for a long time, naturally.
The museum has had shipwreck artifacts since it first opened in 1976, and has been a custodian of shipwreck artifacts for the past 35 years. We opened an exhibit in 2012 called Shipwreck Island. Some concludes to our past, and a good percentage of our 16th and 17th century shipwreck artifacts are on display in that exhibit. Those little ribs are from a Chinese fan, and that's just before it got highly fashionable in the Elizabethan period to have your fan. This is some of the earliest Chinese export porcelain that was crossing from Asia via the Philippines, going to Mexico or to Peru. Then it would go on the back of a donkey and go to a port in the Gulf of Mexico and then sail on back to Europe. Ceramics are probably one of the best artifacts to be able to pinpoint the origins and the date. Certain ceramics were only fashionable for a 10-year period, so if you find that, you can help date your wreck.
If I saw a shipwreck tomorrow, I would have a general idea as to nationality and whether it would be worth the effort or not. I can look at it and see, you know. Ballast has a great role in nationality. If it's coming from Europe, France, England, it's more than likely to have flint rock on it. If a ship is, let's say, coming from US, that side of the world, it's going to have a different ballast rock in it. That's an indication that can be traced, and you can say, oh, that's come from so-and-so and so-and-so. Wood itself also tells a tale where it was built. Certain woods at certain latitudes, certain ships was built with that. I would also be looking for pottery. Each and every nationality has their own pottery. So, you know, that's the sort of thing you have to put together.
Whenever you find anything, you want to find out what it is, what it was used for, who used it, what age it was, you know, that sort of thing. So I read a lot of books, as you can see behind me, and gradually got information. MENDEL Peterson's History Under the Sea is sort of the Bible of the divers. He was really the father of underwater archaeology. That's how I got some knowledge. MENDEL was dead on, he was good.
A great many of these sites were worked in the 1950s and 60s at the dawn of marine archaeology during the period when salvage was the primary aim. Unfortunately, the work that was done in Bermuda in the 50s, 60s and 70s was largely not published, and unfortunately there aren't many records that we've been able to find. Very little in the way of recording the excavation itself, the site itself, and all that sort of stuff. Just because something has been examined in the past doesn't mean that there's no more it can tell us. The Warwick is another example of that. That was initially discovered by Teddy Tucker, and he did a bit of work on it with the Philadelphia Maritime Museum in the 70s. And then in the past 5 years, it's been revisited by a team from our museum. And they actually uncovered and recorded all of the timbers, which hadn't been done before, and they found a great many more artifacts, including a cannon. And together with the artifacts that were recovered in the earlier excavation, we've got quite a lot of information that can be put together and analyzed and published. So another example of what modern archaeology is doing is that it's publishing results.
The museum has been actively conserving, researching, documenting shipwreck artifacts, but also documenting ships and publishing the finds on those scientific investigations. So we've been working with universities from abroad, students, Bermudians, and documenting shipwrecks from all different centuries and raising artifacts, and then conserving those, documenting, researching, and exhibiting and publishing on our finds. What happens when you do archaeology? You're removing artifacts, you're uncovering it, so you kind of destroy and mess up the site. So you have to make sure that it is properly done, and documentation is key, because technology changes. So when researchers or people looking at these shipwrecks in 300 years' time want to look back at these artifacts, at the drawings and the documentation that we did, We've got that all documented.
The beauty of the science today of archaeology is that now we're actually able to get into the sort of chemical analysis or the sort of deep technological analysis of shipwrecks. Just as we did just now with the perfume on the Mary Celestia. And so there are all these extra add-on pieces that we can take advantage of. The way the internet is now, huge amounts of archival material is now just a click away on your computer. There's a lot of material, and so it's a lot easier to get caught up in the lore of shipwrecks in Bermuda than it ever was. And so I think that's really hopeful for the future, because there are going to be people coming saying, you know, I read this story, or I saw this book, or I saw this program, and I read about my ancestors, some are related to that shipwreck. And the amount of information that's out there is going to attract and draw a lot more attention than I think we've ever had in regards to our shipwrecks. And so how we handle those discoveries has never been more important. And so the strength of having strong conservation measures is actually really important right now.
It's quite a long time from discovery through excavation, conservation, documentation, analysis, from sort of microscopic analysis, sending things overseas to have pollen analysis or narrow down the date a tree was felled, from looking at the dendrochronology of the tree rings. So there's all that scientific stuff, and then there's all the comparative work that has to be done. All the correspondence with other people in the field of colonial shipbuilding, looking at old engravings and shipwrights, treatises and descriptions in related archives, like the archives of the Indies or colonial archives. So it's a rather long process archaeologically. One of the ways that this information has made its way to the public is through publication. And publication then gradually makes its way out into more popular forms of communication, whether it's exhibitions, films, books. So I've had a couple of good films that have showed the marine archaeology underway and all the work that that entails. And that's been working really well.
Part of the role of the museum is to be generating new knowledge. When we want to investigate a wreck, we really have to think about, will this wreck provide new historical information and change humanity's perception of the past? But also, can we ensure that we have enough means to start the project and take it to the end? Can we properly document it? Can we properly publish the findings and bring it to a public level? Because it's not just a resource for Bermudians, but also to help with cultural heritage. So we should be considering that if we are bringing stuff up, can we properly care for it? Bermuda is wonderful. A lot of these shipwrecks are in 30 feet of water. But we do have to be careful because you've got warm water, you've got teredo worm, which likes to eat the wood. You've got vicious storms in the winter and hurricanes, and sand can be moved all over, wrecks can be picked up and moved too. So whenever we do an excavation, we make sure we always rebury the site. A wreck can be really well preserved for a long period of time as long as it's in an anaerobic environment. So there is no serious rush all the time to dig everything up. The museum plays a really important role in caring for these artifacts. When you bring artifacts from the ocean, they're saturated with salts, and conservation is how we stabilize and preserve these artifacts. So all of those salts have to be removed. The first round of conservation is leaching the salts out, but in Bermuda's humid, salty environment, degradation is always going to happen. It's an ongoing process. It never finishes. So the museum has has a big responsibility when something comes into the collection, that it's not just supposed to be preserved for my lifetime, it is for generations and generations of Bermudians and the world.
The other little jar there, that was all in pieces. It was originally 121 pieces. Bill Gillies actually put the pieces together, and he did a terrific job. He also did some restoration work on that as well. He rebuilt it. We were very lucky to get all the pieces of that one and to be able to have the skill available to put it together. Bill did a terrific job on that restoration.
I work on mostly glass. I prefer glass, but also pottery, ceramics, and to a lesser extent, metal. Metals are pretty difficult without a lot of equipment. It's expensive equipment. My interest in restoration started because there was sort of an unwritten law that the owner of the boat got what you found. And I found some pretty nice things, but they were taken. So then I looked around and I said, well, out of maybe 10 things, 9 of them were broken. So if I want to accumulate anything, I've got to do something with the broken pieces. So I used to bring them home and I'd experiment with them. I read about techniques. A lot of trial and error. There's a lot to restoration, as you might imagine, depending on the material. The first piece I ever did was from the Eagle, and she had these bottles called shaft and globes, which is just that, a round bottom with a tall neck. And they're sort of the first English wine and spirit bottles. And that was my first bottle that I did. And after that, the other divers used to bring me their bottles. The more you do, the better you get. And then I went on to ceramics, and so that's how I got into restoration.
That's a cannonball. We leached out all the salts and we were able to crack open, and inside was a perfectly preserved cannonball. But unfortunately, if you look at this bosun's whistle, the metal inside is totally corroded. These are all metal artifacts that have been under the water for an extensive period in time. And when the metal rusts, it binds with organic material and sand and has a big, thick layer of concretion. And it can either protect it, or if water or air gets in and corrodes the metal, everything inside will disintegrate. So if it's heavy in weight, you'll know that metal has survived and it's probably worthwhile to conserve. But if you do X-ray it and there's little metal, you know that it might just totally disintegrate. So even the conservation process, you have to evaluate, will I destroy it? And when you're dealing with composite artifacts, it's also very difficult.
I guess the most difficult would be the pistol, because it's composed of 3 different things: brass, wood, and iron. See how it looked when it came? You have to soak it for a long time in fresh water in order to get all the salt out, because if you don't, when you dry it, the salts will crystallize in the body of the piece and maybe destroy the piece itself. I had to make that barrel because the iron had all gone. And I read about how to do the barrel. And I had to make the firing mechanism. This was very complicated. It was all encrusted with marine growth. So I said, all right, I've got a composite artifact. The brass is good, so I don't have to worry about that. The wood is there. It was waterlogged, but the wood is still there. I have to treat that. And the Iron is not there, so I don't have to treat that. And I left the encrustation on here because what grows on that, you use for a mold. So that was probably the most difficult and probably the best one I've done.
If you have a nice coin, there might be an intrinsic value of $200 or $300 in the metal. But depending on the rarity of the coin, that coin could actually be worth thousands of dollars. So just as the local divers were working on the steamers, they were starting to come across some of these older wrecks. And they were starting to see a difference in the value of the material that they were recovering. And that really started to transform their ideas in terms of what shipwrecks are worth, what the value of shipwrecks are.
The average person that finds a shipwreck, where is the gold? Where is the silver? But it's just not there. Wasn't there to begin with. Gold and silver, that's only found on certain shipwrecks. But every artifact can be a treasure. There are pieces that I can talk about, and each and every one, I know where they came from.
One of the wonderful things about our shipwreck history is that it's totally tangible. There are multiple of houses and buildings you can go to where you find pieces of this salvage lifestyle. You have a house I could think of near Botanical Gardens where all the porch beams are spars from different ships. I know someone who's got a tea set from the Cristobal Colon. And I think that's part of that three-dimensionality. People sort of having their hands on culture, sort of feeling a sense of that. And I think for a lot of these old collectors or old finders of things, the objects themselves are intrinsically valuable. Each one they pick up and they go, gee, the day I was there, I was with so-and-so, and we just done that, and the sun was doing this, and it was a wonderful day. And so they focus you on a point in time and they stop your world. And there's a happiness in sort of slowing down time. Like a day out looking at shipwrecks or diving on shipwrecks is like a 78-hour day. The day is huge. And I think those are the kind of things that make it, incredibly valuable to us.
I couldn't tell you exactly what year I started, but I know it was a long time ago. Way back then, we had a system with the government that if you found something, you had to record it, obviously, and you had to apply for permission to work on it. But at that time, whatever was found was yours. Well, since then, many of the rules and regulations have been changed. What I find amusing and annoying is, if I found a shipwreck tomorrow and I want to work on that shipwreck, you've got to go to the government. Then they appoint some underwater archaeologists, which I'm not. Then they look at it. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's like, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that anymore. Crazy.
In 2001, Bermuda passed a pretty progressive legislation that protected our shipwrecks, historic shipwrecks. And that means that if you want to investigate a ship, you have to have a license and you should be doing it scientifically. And that all items, all shipwreck artifacts and underwater cultural heritage belong to the people of Bermuda. You can get a license just to do a preliminary survey, sort of reconnaissance. But you have to apply for permission to do a little digging around just to make sure that it is the wreck that you think you've identified it. The biggest threats to underwater cultural heritage are just people who don't know the law and just take stuff, not understanding the significance that when you remove something from a site, it's all part of a story that helps you to unravel the bigger picture. And so even just shifting around some artifacts can actually really change the story and, and your understanding.
Bermuda's shipwreck legislation is in line with the underwater cultural heritage management, which essentially revolves around this idea of in situ preservation, that only people who can actually record and report their work should be allowed to work on shipwrecks. Also that any material that's found on shipwrecks should stay in the public domain and be managed exclusively by academic and cultural institutions. But that is by no means the only view. My view is that participation is key to maintaining those traditions. So if we want to manage it in such a way that actually is in the best interests of everybody here in Bermuda, we're going to have to start figuring out where we can cooperate. And I think going forward, the competing interests, i.e. local knowledge and academic knowledge, need to figure out how to maintain and manage this concept, which I think is critically important, of continued participation by regular Bermudian mariners.
The legislature now, you're not allowed to pick up anything. You can look on a wreck, but you can't pick anything off of it. I don't totally disagree with it, but I think it should be eased up a little bit, and I'll give you a reason for that. Supposing you're hanging on a rope behind the boat and you look down and you see maybe a musket or a sword on the bottom. As it stands, you're not allowed to pick that up. You have to go and tell government that it's there. You go back out a week later and all the reef look like that. So it's gone. So wouldn't it be better for me, or whoever finds it, to have picked it up in the first place and then taken it and shown it to government? It's counterproductive. And nothing's been found since the last Wreck Act. What I think should happen, I think that if the person's looking after it, I think they should be allowed to keep it. Government should be allowed to photograph it and find out where it came from, and maybe borrow it for exhibits and stuff, but then give it back to the finder. Otherwise, who's going to turn anything in?
This is the most difficult part of the question about shipwrecks, which is ownership. It might be a bit obvious to say it. People feel a sense of possession for the things they find. Being in shipwrecks has been a Bermudian activity forever. And so to suddenly sort of make it a two-dimensional thing that we're all supposed to look at, and that somehow that's going to be okay, I don't think that's okay. And so I think that we can have people fully invested in these activities and at the same time doing it to the highest scientific kind of standards and archaeological standards. The advantages of being formally trained and being part of a formal network mean that you have access to conservation and publication and all these things. And actually, it's kind of my hope that in terms of how we approached the next phase of exploration in Bermuda, that we would be working with these knowledge experts, people with an incredible amount of local knowledge, and co-authoring and giving them access to these more formal academic networks and the resources that go with that, be they conservation labs, etc. We just lost Mr. Tucker, and it's inquantifiable, the amount of scientific information that we no longer have access to in relation to Bermuda's shipwrecks and ocean knowledge generally. So I really look forward to that kind of happening in the academic world towards being more inclusive, towards those kinds of alternative knowledge bases.
There's a huge market for people who are interested in these artifacts, who've got an interest in history and diving. This stuff should be a cultural resource that we should protect and pass on, and it shouldn't get dispersed. It shouldn't go into private collections. It should be for people of Bermuda and future generations. So this stuff should be in the hands of cultural institutions who are equipped to look after it. And the importance of that is that the public and researchers can always come back to one place to study that collection. All of those artifacts, all of the records that relate to those artifacts, the research that the museum's carried out. When we've got such a large collection, it's great for cross-examination, comparing, and it's a better benefit for researchers and the general public.
I have ownership of all this now. I could sell it overseas, I could give it away, I could break it up, but it should stay here. It shouldn't be exported. What's found here belongs here, you know, it does, I think.
That evolution you have of salvage to shipwreck science, you know, is kind of a natural progression. If you actually look at it, if you actually sort of step back and objectively look at the history of what's happened, you had a couple of discoveries of treasure. Of course, that's intrinsically valuable. But then very quickly you realize that a piece of treasure is worth exponentially more if you understand its history and its provenance. And so from that you get the need to start doing research, going deeper in terms of your knowledge and understanding, which means slowing down in terms of your salvage and the way you approach a shipwreck. And then you had a generation of guys that spent a lot of time in archives using a standard that was not the standard of the salvage divers, right? And so over a certain period, we start applying these kinds of rules and regulations. And so when the Historic Wrecks Act came along in 2001, and that was just the logical extension of, okay, well, we're now moving away from wrecks and salvage into the value of them as scientific objects and objects of research and interest to the population generally. So I think we're just in the formation now of what the next generation or the next set of people look like who deal with shipwrecks in this particular way. And I'm hopeful that, you know, a generation will emerge.
The cultural material is important, but if you simply take that material, put it on a dusty museum shelf, without keeping alive the activity itself, then in that case, Bermudians become passive observers in their own cultural traditions. And those traditions die. First time I ever went out with Teddy, he still had the Explorer. And the place to be was on the flying bridge with him as he was steering the boat. And he would just be telling stories and you'd just soak up the stories and the information as you're interacting within the environment. It's a great way to learn.
There are people still finding stuff as they spearfish and so on. I'm hopeful that at some point there'll be a local person who probably stumbles upon something quite incredible in our reef system. And I hope that in my position I will be able to assist in making sure that we marry their interests, the interests of Bermuda, the interests of cultural heritage, and all those will come together. But 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks a year, you know, spending time looking around for shipwrecks doesn't compare to years of being involved with maritime activities and being a part of what's going on.
I have always encouraged Bermudians to consider underwater archaeology, and I've had streams of Bermudian students work on underwater archaeology projects and stuff. We've got Bermudian archaeologists. It's just trying to convince people to do the underwater part. We do as much as we can to encourage, and I wish we could get a Bermudian underwater archaeologist, but hopefully that might come in the future.
I have spent a tremendous amount of time on it. You're not going to get rich. The only richness you're going to get is knowledge. I do think I contributed something when we set up the Bermuda Underwater Institute. I still have stuff on display there, and it's great to see people learning from what so many other people have put efforts into. All in all, I've enjoyed it. When it comes to shipwrecks, I can remember a lot. And there's a number of them out there. And I don't by no means believe that they've all been found.
I stopped diving sometime in the 80s because I couldn't handle the sun and all that kind of stuff. But I'm doing more restorations because my friends are bringing it to me. They have a restoration laboratory up at Dockyard, but they don't have a restorer at the moment, or whatever you want to call them. Well, I started in '65, and I'm still doing it, you know, but I'm not diving, that's all. I'm still restoring things. And I was fortunate again to get quite good at it.
I value the experiences that I received working with Jetty, and so one of my favorite things to do is to actually take people out and introduce them to the techniques and the environment. It's something that I enjoy doing, and what I really, really hope is that the young people coming along behind me will continue to be able to have those kinds of experiences that I had, because they're so valuable to me personally. And I would really hope that those remain available to future generations of Bermudians.
What you realize pretty quickly when you go out with these old guys, the activity is not necessarily the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is just being out there. It really is a sort of journey, getting your time on the boat, being out on the water. You know, the finding of something is wonderful, but the search and the hunt and the camaraderie and the time on the water, you know, the space, the mental space that it gives you, that's the real prize in my mind.
How about if we just go to the edge of this little flat here and then run up the outside, slip over and come down the other side of it, and as we do that we'll go right over the cage structure, and we'll see if he sees that.
Yeah, can you get over that there?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great way to spend time. Get in a boat with your friends. Go out and work on the shipwreck. I mean, I can hardly think of anything that's better than that.
Many, many years ago, they used to sing and dance all the way from Somerset to St. Jude. They used to sing and dance as they went along, singing a happy but a teasing kind of song. What they singing, man? They go like, all the way from Mangrove Bay. That's where all the old maids stay. All the way to Crowland Cider. Nothing there but foolish pride. What you say, man? Spanish Point, half a gallon and half a pointer, all the way to Devonshire Point, brackish water and rotten corn. Man, you say that's funny, man. They used to sing and dance as they went along, yes, singing a happy but a teasing kind of song. Yeah, man.